Okay, chapter 28, regulating temperature, nutrients, and body fluids. Most of our regulatory functions in the human body or any animal body are dealt with in what is called a negative feedback loop. A negative feedback loop is basically a thermostat that moves the original stimuli in the other direction. In the case of a heater, if the room temperature gets cold to a certain point, it turns the heater on, which warms up the room. When the room gets to a certain level of warmth, it turns off and it starts cooling down again. And so it's constantly going back and forth. So if the room is too cold, it warms it. If the room is too warm, it turns off so that it will cool down. This is called a negative feedback loop. And this is how your body controls things like temperature, nutrients, blood levels of certain ions or compositions, anything like that. Thermoregulation. This is one of the most important parts of homeostasis, maintaining a temperature that is conducive to life. And so thermoregulation is control of body temperature. The main source can be internal or external. An endotherm regulates body temperature internally, meaning that it has a way to generate heat internally to keep the body warm. All right? And it can balance out heat loss, as if you're walking around outside and you get cold, your body will shiver. Basically, it'll take the muscle fibers and rub them together very rapidly to generate friction and heat. And endotherms are the most advanced forms of animals. Basically, this ties in with the hypothalamus, which is a part or a projection coming out of the brain. There are thermoreceptors, and it will control your temperature within a few degrees. When you take your temperature, what you're doing is your temperature has these little oscillations. As you get a little too warm, you might sweat and cool off. If you get too cold, you might shiver and generate some heat. And when you take your temperature, you just get the average of a series of measurements to give you an overall body temperature. Ectotherms. These are animals that have to get sources of heat and or cooling from different areas. So if it's 50 degrees outside, the animal will be 50 degrees, unless it can find a place that's warmer, like in a burrow or some kind of hide or cover, and it can warm up. Or if the sun comes out, it will bask, meaning it will lay out in the sunlight to absorb heat from sunlight to warm it up. Reptiles are an excellent example of this sort of creature. In the mornings, when they wake up, they come outside and bask and absorb heat. Then they start their process of feeding, resting, and moving in and out of the sunlight. If they get too warm, they'll jump into some shade and try to cool off. Ectotherms take a lot less energy to maintain body temperature. They require less food than endotherms. A lot of snakes will stop eating in the winter. They cool off, and if you want to produce offspring of endangered species of snakes, it's necessary to have a cooling off period, which allows their body to go through its proper thermocycle, which will allow it to produce the proper hormonal cycles so that it will be prepared to breed, because most reptiles only breed once a year. Nutrient homeostasis. Well, how do you the difference between hunger and satiation? Now, there are some words here, some definitions we need to talk about. One is heterotrophs. Heterotrophs consume food to get carbon and energy. So heterotrophic animals eat other animals. The opposite of heterotroph is an autotroph, which uses inorganic nutrients and an energy source, usually sunlight, to build its own organic molecules. There are other energy sources like thermal vents down in the ocean floor, where entire ecosystems of organisms evolve. And all of these nutrients are used to fuel cellular respiration in animals and to build its tissue and biomass. The amount of food and nutrition that an animal or organism needs to survive depends a lot on its size. The smaller the size, the more nutrients and food the animal is going to need because of surface to volume ratio. A smaller animal has a larger surface to volume ratio, so it can lose heat a lot quicker than larger animals. So they have to eat a lot more food relative to body size. And then young need a lot of food as well. The reason for that is they are metabolically charged. They're undergoing a lot of mitosis, getting bigger very quickly, very rapidly. And so they need huge amounts of food. Now, a varied diet. We require macronutrients and micronutrients. The macronutrients, obviously, are the ones in large amounts. Micronutrients are required in small amounts, often trace amounts. Here are some of the essential vitamins and minerals. Most of these are enzymes that we need, certain amounts. Now, some we need in large amounts and some we need in smaller amounts. Best way to obtain the required macro and micronutrients is to eat a varied diet, as outlined by the U.S. government's dietary guidelines. You need grains, dairy, protein, vegetables, and fruits. Carbs, there's a lot of people that are cutting back on carbs, and that's okay. You don't have to eliminate carbs completely, but the average American does eat way too many carbs. Carbohydrates come in the form of potato chips and candy and bread, etc. And most people eat way too much of that, and that can be converted into fat. Calories are a measure of food's energy content. To maintain a constant body weight, an animal has to eat as many calories as it expends. If you eat too many calories, if you eat more calories than you need, you will store the extra calories in fat. Okay? And nutrients are involved in things like eating disorders. Okay? And this is really not the place to discuss that in depth, but there are several eating disorders that would be worth talking about briefly. Let's see. There we go. There's anorexia. This is basically self-imposed starvation. For some reason, a person who is below optimal weight thinks that they are above optimal weight, and so they're obsessed with trying to get thinner. This can be a lethal condition. There's also bulimia. You eat a huge amount of food and then you induce vomiting. And there's other different eating disorders. Again, this isn't really the place to discuss this. But it is a serious issue, and if you have any of these problems, definitely there are places you can go to get help. It comes down to what I believe is called body dysmorphia. For some reason, you feel like you're overweight when you're not. Okay. Now, you can deprive yourself of nutrients and eventually even start digesting your muscles and heart for protein to generate energy. Obesity, if calorie intake is consistently exceeds calories spent. Now, there's a lot of reasons for obesity, being overweight. Some of them are what you would call glandular. There is some kind of disruption or a dysfunction in certain metabolic processes that causes people to gain weight. One example, if you're not producing enough leptin, you can become overweight fairly easily. Okay, there is genetic influences for gaining weight or keeping weight off. We all have a basal metabolic rate that's generated by our mitochondria, which are burning calories to make energy. Over time, as you get older, some of those mitochondria get lost to the system and they cease functioning and burning calories. And so maybe as a young person, you had a hard time keeping weight on, but as you get older, it starts getting easier and easier to gain weight and lose the extra weight. Again, this is depending on what's causing it, can be problematic. Being overweight can be detrimental to your health. Being overweight can increase cholesterol levels in your bloodstream. It contributes to heart disease, and being overweight can cascade and increase general susceptibility to disease. It can make you just in general less healthy. You'll have less energy. And contributing to this, besides biological functions, there are psychological functions. Our society is obsessed with certain body images, and those body images are probably not the most healthy or realistic. So that's where the psychological comes into. I would also suggest that our dependence upon social media and websites like Instagram, etc., can lead to bullying about weight, especially for children, and lead to serious body dysmorphias. It's a complex problem that really should be dealt with in another course. Now, what they eat and how they eat. There's several different things. There are some big groups. There are herbivores, which eat only plants. To be a herbivore, you have to have a second stomach, a rumen type organ that helps you break down and digest and get nutrients from cellulose. Cellulose is a type of carbohydrate chain in plants that only certain organisms can get nutrients, cows, horses, etc. Carnivores eat only other animals. Now, they still get vegetables because usually the first thing, like this leopard here will eat, will be the entrails, the stomach, and the intestines of an animal. And the animals they normally eat are herbivores, so that's where they get their vegetables. They basically let another animal assemble all the nutrients they need to survive, and they keep these herbivore populations in check. Detritivores consume decomposing organic matter. These are basically recyclers. And then you have omnivores, which eat a lot of different things. And within herbivores, there are subspecialities like frugivores. These are animals that only eat fruit, etc. You don't need to know that, but these four, I think, are important. Ingestion versus digestion. Ingestion is just bringing the food into the GI tract. Digestion starts with chewing of the food, churning of the stomach. Enzymes and acids start breaking it down into smaller and smaller molecules, which helps generate energy. Absorption is when the nutrients enters the cell lining the digestive tract. So first you're going to chew it up, you swallow it, the stomach mixes it with a lot of stuff to help digest it down into smaller particles, and squeezes out a small amount of eaten food into the intestines. The small intestines are where absorption of the nutrients occur. And then you go into the large intestines. This is where we reclaim most of our water. And then through the anus, we get rid of any undigested food from the body. There are a couple of different types of digestive tracts. And there's a couple of different digestion modes. You can basically digest food inside in the just outside of the cells. You can do it extracellularly, for instance, just in a cavity. There's two models for digestive tracts, incomplete and complete. A complete has a mouth and an anus. So this earthworm has a complete digestive tract. This flatworm has a mouth that goes into a cavity, and then it also serves as the elimination. So food goes in, waste matter comes out through the same opening. That's just an incomplete digestive tract. And then the alimentary canal is just the GI tract, starting at the mouth and ending at the anus. Ruminants, these are specialized, these are herbivores. And they have this cecum, or rumen, they call it a second stomach. And herbivores tend to have very long, complex GI tracts. Whereas here's a carnivore, which has a stomach and a relatively short GI tract. Okay. Here is a diagram showing some of the human digestive system. You've got your mouth, which is mechanical breakdown. You chew up the food, and it becomes a bolus. Then you have a pharynx. You have an esophagus. The esophagus leads into the stomach. Now up here you have salivary glands, and the first thing that gets digested in the mouth is a carbohydrate. Okay, and so amylase starts breaking down like bread or carbs. Liver actually helps you digest fat, and it produces bile, which collects in the gallbladder and then drips into the small intestine. The pancreas produces enzymes, digestive enzymes, things like that. Here in the stomach, you mix everything together and then squeeze it out in little dollops into the small intestine, which are easier to digest and absorb. You get the final enzymes breaking it down to its molecules, and the molecules are diffusing into the bloodstream. Large intestine absorbs water and minerals to form feces, and then they expel everything through the rectum and anus. Here is basically a bolus of chewed food. Now this is it's made of this stuff called chyme, CHYME. Okay, so it comes out of the stomach as chyme in these little boluses, and is digested and squeezed into the small intestine. There's your salivary glands. Tongue is important. It basically takes the food, moistens it so it's easier to swallow through the esophagus, and that is called the bolus, and so your tongue helps form that. Now, gastric juice includes lots of different things, but it's got pepsin. Pepsin is an enzyme that helps digest protein. It's got hydrochloric acid, mucus, salts, water. It has these little pits. And here in the stomach, this is where the chyme is produced. So the bolus comes down here. This is the pyloric sphincter. And it goes to this sphincter and is squeezed. The chyme is squeezed out into the small intestine. I'm sorry, I misspoke. This is the cardiac sphincter. This is the pyloric sphincter. Okay. Now, the small intestine has these little things called villi, and they are lined with a type of epidermal tissue. There is lined with this simple columnar, simple meaning one layer, columnar, rectangular shaped epithelial tissue. There are goblet cells in there that help secrete mucus so that the food continues to move along. And then there's a diffusion of nutrients into these blood streams, these blood systems, or capillary networks inside the villi. Pancreas, gallbladder release chemicals. Okay, this diagram is going to show you basically some of the organs of the GI tract and kind of what they do. Liver is primarily concerned with detoxifying poisons and breaking down and digesting fats. The gallbladder stores bile, and sometimes it'll get clogged, and you can actually have a gallbladder removal, and your body will function fine without it. Stomach is for mixing. Small intestine is final breakdown and absorption of nutrients. Pancreas produces multiple types of digestive enzymes and also is involved with certain cells producing glucagon and insulin to balance your blood sugar levels. Large intestine absorbs water and minerals to form feces. The large intestine here has got three parts. It's got the ascending, transverse, and descending colon. Goes into the anus. If you get a colonoscopy, they basically put a camera up and check out your colon, looking for any polyps or anything like that. And this is basically concerned with reabsorbing water from the digestive solution, minerals, ions, anything that's beneficial. And as it pulls that stuff out, it compacts the food into feces. Okay, so let's look at nitrogenous wastes. Now, there's bulk mass waste that comes out of the anal region, but we also filter our blood and we pull out nitrogen waste in the form of ammonia. And we concentrate it in several ways. So we absorb nutrients and we excrete metabolic waste. Okay. So in the digestive tract, enzymes are going to break these proteins into amino acids. A good example of an enzyme would be pepsin. During the cellular metabolism, little amino groups are stripped from the amino acids, and these form ammonia, which is NH3. Ammonia enters the bloodstream at the liver. It's converted to a waste molecule called urea that is excreted in urine. Now, water and salts, osmoregulation. Basically, our body is full of different solutions, and these solutions are constantly diffusing different enzymes, nutrients, oxygen, carbon dioxide, all kinds of things are diffusing across membranes. Now, osmoregulation is basically salt and water inside and outside the body. Okay, and we have to stay hydrated. All right. Now, if we look at fish, they live in a liquid environment, so they are swimming around in a solution all the time. Okay, and there's two types of water in our planet. There's salt water and there's fresh water. Okay, now inside each fish is a solution of solutes in the solvent water inside their bodies. Now, in a saltwater tank, the solute percentage in the water is higher on the outside than on the inside. So it's going to try to become equal. Basically, they want to become not hypertonic or hypotonic. They want to become isotonic with the solution inside the fish. So out here is hypertonic, meaning the most solutes. Inside is hypotonic, meaning the least solutes. So what's going to happen is water is going to be constantly sucked out of a fish. So that means a fish is always drinking. They never stop drinking water. They drink seawater and drink seawater. Excess salts are gotten rid of through special cells in the gills. They produce a uric acid that's very concentrated. I'm sorry, I misspoke. They produce ammonia, which comes out, and so they don't have a whole lot of water coming out when they urinate because water is constantly being diffused out of the body. Now, in the terms of, let's talk about common home aquaria. There are people that keep saltwater tanks. And they often ask, well, why can't I keep as many fish per gallon in a saltwater tank as I can in a freshwater tank? And a big part of that comes down to this process. Ammonia is the most lethal waste product out there, and ammonia can kill animals very quickly. It will acidify the water to a point that the pH will get out of balance. It'll kick the pH out of balance in the animal, and they'll die. Okay? Now, in a freshwater fish, they never drink because their hypertonic solution is inside. There are more solutes inside the fish than outside in freshwater. So they're constantly getting water, but they never stop urinating because otherwise they would swell up and explode. Okay? And then they're constantly actually bringing salts and things inside to try to maintain their level of solute percentage in order to stay alive. Now, freshwater fish, instead of excreting pure ammonia, have concentrated it into urea or uric acid. And this is because the bodies of water that are freshwater tend to be smaller and they're more populated. So they've evolved a way of not polluting their environment. Now, your marine fish are in an ocean that covers 70% of the Earth's surface. So volume per fish is not an issue. So they just never developed these strategies. And all of this is called osmoregulation. In us, body fluid homeostasis is dealt with in our urinary system. The blood eliminates nitrogenous wastes, helps maintain the ion concentration of body fluids. This is done in the kidneys. Okay? So our urinary system basically, have paired kidneys, and they're constantly filtering the blood, and they form a filtrate, and then they recapture a huge amount of the solutes in the filtrate, eventually producing urine. Now, the tube between the kidney and the bladder is called the ureter, and then the urethra goes from the bladder to the outside, and that's what releases the urine as a waste product. This is all accomplished in these things called nephrons that filter and cleanse the blood. And they function purely on diffusion and concentration of solutes. Okay, here's a diagram of a nephron, and I'm going to give you a basic of what moves in, what moves out. And then I will also give a link in your coursework to a good video, an animated video of how this all works so you can see it moving. But you build up metabolic poisons or waste products in your bloodstream. Now, the bloodstream is not just blood. It's got all kinds of stuff in it, both good things and bad things, nutrients and oxygen, waste products, and carbon dioxide. So here's your bloodstream coming into this little capsule. Okay, and the pressure builds here, and a bunch of filtrate is forced out of the pores of this little capillary bed in here. Okay, now the filtrate is going to go through several parts. First, it goes through what is called the distal convoluted tubule, the descending limb of the loop of Henle. This is a loop of Henle. That's part of your nephron. The ascending limb going up, the distal convoluted tubule, and then it goes into the collecting duct to be excreted as urine. So the filtrate, the first thing that we do here in the filtrate is we start taking some water and we reabsorb it into the bloodstream. We reabsorb some sodium chloride ions to make salt. We reabsorb glucose. We reabsorb certain amino acids. We basically get rid of drugs and poisons and filter them out into the filtrate. We get rid of excess hydrogen ions. Hydrogen ions play a role in the pH of the blood, and sometimes you have too many. The more free hydrogen ions you have, the more acidic the solution is, and we can't let our bloodstream get too acidic. So then the filtrate, we've reclaimed some stuff and we've added to it. So from the blood into the filtrate, we've pumped some hydrogen ions and certain drugs and poisons. Then it starts going down, and as it goes down the loop of Henle, on this side, water is pulled from the filtrate and reclaimed and goes back into our bloodstream. As it climbs, now as we pull water out, the concentration of this filtrate increases. Now, as we climb, sodium and chloride ions are pulled out and put back in the bloodstream. That's salt. And so the concentration of the solution drops. Then it gets here, we will reabsorb some more salt, we'll reabsorb some more water, and we'll excrete and get rid of some more hydrogen ions. It'll all dump here into the collecting duct. Now in the collecting duct, water will be reclaimed, and some urea will be reclaimed. The urea is reclaimed because it plays a role in concentration levels between solutes and solvents over here for the loop of Henle. And you'll get a better feel for that when you watch the animated film, which you can find on YouTube. So this is a simplified diagram. Basically, you have an arteriole coming into this little Bowman's capsule and one going out, and it causes a lot of pressure, which forces out the initial filtrate. Certain things can have some effect. Hormones can have an effect on how much filtrate you produce, how much urine you produce. Hormones like ADH regulate kidney function. High ADH levels signal the kidneys to decrease water loss. So if you're dehydrated, you will produce ADH and it will reclaim a lot of water. There's special pores that will open up in the collecting duct to reclaim as much water as possible. Aldosterone also increases the reabsorption of sodium. Sodium is the most osmotically active particle in the human body. There are some things that can affect that. For instance, alcohol and caffeine will disable ADH so that it can't open pores to reclaim water. You may have experienced that if you drink a lot of sodas or iced tea or coffee or alcohol like beer or something. You will notice that you'll start going to the bathroom more and if you look at your urine, it will be, sometimes it's clear instead of straw colored. Okay. Aldosterone, there are medications. If you have a high blood pressure, there are medications that will interfere with the aldosterone production so that you don't reclaim water into your bloodstream. So less water comes into your bloodstream, your blood pressure will drop. That's going to wrap up my discussion of Chapter 28. You can find more information in your textbook, and you can always use YouTube and do searches for nephrons, loops of Henle, things like that. That will give you animated versions. I'll try to give you a link to an animated version that I think is good. But unfortunately, stuff goes up and down on YouTube all the time, so I cannot guarantee, and it's kind of hard to keep up to check if that link is still good from semester to semester. That wraps it up. I will talk to you next in chapter 29.